Hi everyone, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we're going to be talking about the stomach. Our objectives for this video include becoming familiar with both the gross and microanatomy of the stomach. So we'll look at its big features and we'll talk about how it communicates with other organs. And then we'll take a closer look at the cells that make up its lining and talk about how they secrete the gastric juices that are involved in chemical digestion. All right, so here we are right here in the stomach. We finally made it down into the abdomen, and we are about to run into our first big bout of chemical digestion. Now, this stomach is a very busy place. It has features that are going to participate in secretion, mixing and propulsion, and chemical digestion and absorption. So a lot going on here. But before we get into some of those specific processes, let us take a little tour of the stomach's gross anatomy. When we look at the abdominal cavity as it would appear in the gross anatomy lab without moving anything around, the stomach actually kind of hides behind a number of other structures. So we've got the greater omentum here, we've got our abdominal diaphragm here and our liver here, and we can just barely see a little bit of the stomach peeking out between the liver and the greater omentum. Okay, so let's switch over here to our more stylized drawing. Things have been moved around to give us a better view, and we see the stomach here again sitting inferior to the left part of the liver, and we see these little indents here where it is contiguous with the duodenum, or the first part of the small intestine. Okay, and this is going to be a little sphincter muscle that closes them off from each other. We can also see it sits anterior to the pancreas. So we've got the pancreas here that's going to run posterior to the main body of the stomach going that way. The intestines, for the most part, all sit inferior to the stomach. So we've got large intestine and then small intestine continuing on from the duodenum. All right, we're going to divide the stomach itself up into 4 regions. So the cardia is the region that is immediately adjacent to the esophagus. And also it is guarded by the cardiac sphincter, also known as the esophageal sphincter. The body is the large area that is inferior to the cardia. Its walls are covered by folds of mucosa called rugae, and these allow the stomach to expand to accommodate swallowed food, and they provide a greater surface area for the glands that produce digestive juices within the stomach to sit on. The fundus is the bulbous part that sits superior to the body. This tends to fill up with gas during digestion, and fun fact, you can almost always find it on an X-ray. The pylorus then is the most distal portion of the stomach, down here just before it joins up with the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine here. And this juncture is guarded by the pyloric sphincter, which is a very thick, very strong sphincter muscle. It's important that some of the caustic chemicals from the stomach don't leak into the duodenum if the duodenum is not prepared for them to be there. So it is important that this muscle is competent, meaning it can close securely. Just to do a quick comparison here, because I mentioned in the previous video that the lower esophageal sphincter, or the cardiac sphincter, is very often incompetent and the cause of acid reflux. Let's take a look at these different sphincters. So the pyloric sphincter, as I was saying over here, is really thick and substantial. I know this is just an illustration here, but on an actual donor, you're able to palpate this really easily through the wall of the stomach. The cardiac sphincter, on the other hand, is much thinner and weaker. There are fewer muscle fibers here, and the ones that are there are so weak they have to get an assist from the abdominal diaphragm, which helps to pinch this opening closed, okay? So because of this, acid reflux, where stomach juices make their way up into the esophagus, is very common, whereas pyloric issues are much less common. All right, so with the big stuff named, let's start looking at how different smaller features are going to contribute to digestive processes. And we're going to start off here with secretion. Now, the stomach lining, or that innermost mucosa layer, is home to a large number of exocrine glands that produce the stomach's digestive juices. These look a little bit different from some of the exocrine glands that we've seen before. So mostly we've seen this kind over here that cluster around little ducts like this, and then the ducts add to themselves and secrete out through one big duct. Okay. The stomach mucosa glands are much simpler. All right. These are typically referred to as gastric pits because that's what they resemble. They're a simple tubular gland, meaning that they are just a long, slender cavity surrounded by secretory cells, and they have just a single, very short duct here that's going to open up into the lumen of the stomach. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the setup of the stomach lining, and let's start by identifying our stomach layers. Okay, so remember, when we're talking about an organ, we're going to be using directional terms to apply to just that organ. So most superficially, we've got the serosa, which again is visceral peritoneum covering loose connective tissue. Deep to that, we have the muscularis. Muscularis, that's a hard word to say into a microphone. I don't know what it is. All right, muscularis, and then submucosa. And then the layer where these glands sit is going to be the mucosa. And remember, that has three distinct layers on its own. We've got this muscularis mucosae, which changes the shape of the mucosa, but does not propel food. We have the lamina propria. Okay, this is also called MALT. This is where the blood vessels and lymphatic tissues live. And this is also where our glands are going to dip into. And the part of the mucosa that makes up these glands then is going to be the epithelial layer. This is where the secretory cells themselves sit. They're part of the epithelium, and that dips down into these little pits of the lamina propria and lines their walls. Okay, so this is all technically one layer here as we're going through. All right, so if we look over here now, we can see that we have a number of different types of cells that make up these gastric glands. The names by themselves probably don't mean much, so let's add in a little bit of detail. And sorry to make that smaller on you, but we need some text. So making up our epithelium here, we have 4 different kinds of cells, 3 of which are exocrine and 1 of which is endocrine. We can see here that the epithelium is mostly made up of mucus cells, all right? So especially on the surface lining of the stomach here, and this very proximal portion of the duct of the glands here, all right? So beige and pink are both just mucus cells, all right? As we start moving down deeper into the gland, we start running into parietal cells, these purple guys here. So here's the big version. Here are the smaller versions. These get interspersed between the mucus cells, and they are going to secrete hydrochloric acid for chemical digestion. The other cells for chemical digestion sit even deeper in here, and they make up the base portion of the gland. So these orange cells are chief cells, and they're going to secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase. The last type of cell that we're going to find in these pits are enteroendocrine cells. And these are going to secrete gastrin. So these are the gray cells. You can see them here down in the base part of the glands next to the chief cells. Now, I mentioned gastrin very briefly in that other endocrine tissues video a couple days ago. And I think I described it as by the stomach, for the stomach, to make the stomach juices. And now that we are here, you can see how close the cells that secrete gastrin sit to the cells that are going to be secreting the stomach juices. So they're all part of the same gland right here. Now, most of these cells that we just named are secreting things that contribute to chemical digestion. So we're going to skip mixing and propulsion for just a second to talk about what those chemicals do while they're fresh in our brain. We're also going to touch on absorption here because, again, those same cells are involved. The job of the mucus secreted by the mucus cells is primarily to protect the stomach parenchyma, or the deeper tissues. So hydrochloric acid is not something you want to mess around with. And by having a thick mucus layer, the stomach staves off some of the damage that the acid does to its cells. But even with this, the epithelial cells here still need to be replaced about once every 5 to 7 days. Okay, the mucus cells here are also the site of active absorption in the stomach. They're going to bring in water and a couple of other substances like alcohol, aspirin, and some free-floating ions. The substances that are absorbed here are then passed into the lamina propria, this area here. Within this connective tissue layer here, this is where we have all of our capillary beds. So whatever is absorbed by our mucus cells is going to get passed into our capillary beds and then carried off again by the bloodstream. All right, our parietal cells, so the purple guys hanging out in the neck of the gland, produce hydrochloric acid, which is going to digest proteins. And then these chief cells down here secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Pepsinogen turns into pepsin when it's exposed to hydrochloric acid, which, good thing it's made right up here. And that acts to break down amino acid bonds. It's also what begins to digest milk proteins and makes them clump all together. Gastric lipase then is going to break down triglycerides, which are a category of complex fats. All right, now let's come back and take a look at mixing and propulsion. The stomach actually has a specialized muscularis to assist with muscular churning. So most GI organs just have the longitudinal and circular muscle layers, but the stomach has an extra layer here of obliquely oriented muscles that sit deep to its circular fibers. So we've got longitudinal, circular, and oblique. These extra fibers allow the stomach to contract in all directions and really rattle around its contents to mix them up with its gastric juices. This mixing is called churning, and it is different from peristalsis. So peristalsis is coordinated contractions of the circular and longitudinal muscles specifically to push things distally through the tract. But churning's job is simply to mix things up. There isn't a singular direction to it. The stomach does also do peristalsis, though. So after churning, it will fire sequential contractions of its circular fibers, and that will push its contents down past the pyloric sphincter and into the duodenum. And that is going to bring us to the end. So here's a practice question for you. Branches of which artery serve the stomach? And the answer here is A, the celiac trunk. And the reason I put that question there instead of asking something directly from the video is to lead into this slide for you. Okay? I used to put these kind of overview slides at the beginning of these lectures, but people would get really confused about what they were supposed to take away from them. So I'm just going to lay it all out here for you. These are to test yourself. I absolutely do not want you to memorize innervation and blood flow for every individual organ. I don't want you to sit with flashcards and say, stomach is innervated by blah. Things like that, okay? That is not a good use of your time. And instead, I want you to be able to figure these things out using what you know. So, for instance, you should be able to figure out most of these things just by knowing that the stomach is part of the foregut. So as you are studying and you're tracing innervation and blood flow around to your gut organs, come on back here and check your answers. So what brings parasympathetics to the stomach? The stomach is part of the foregut, so it must be vagus. Okay? Use it that way rather than as individual little things you need to check off of a list that you know. And that is going to bring us to the end.